Okay, you've come mostly to the end of your course here, Research Methods, and really you've only just scratched the surface. It's not your fault, it's because there is such a huge amount of information out there, such a huge world to get to know, and it's really the start of a lifelong process. So what I want to do in this final session here is to introduce you to how to take your learning to the next stage. And if you have a look, you'll find that educating yourself is the only real way of doing that. We have got, in fact, I have to say, one of the worst education systems in the world. It's basically not fit for use because it doesn't educate you in the way in which you need to be educated. And it doesn't help you to think for yourself. It doesn't provide you with those critical thoughts that you need to have. What it does instead is it tries to feed you with a certain preset set of information. But to take your education to the next stage, you have to think for yourself. You have to move on and not trust to what the education system itself will give you, and you have to be responsible for your own education. And it's a lifelong process. It's a lifelong learning which you're embarking on here, and it will never end because there's always more stuff to know. And if you're perpetually curious, then you'll find out all the stuff that you do need to know, because it will guide you that kind of way. Let me remind you of the purpose of education according to Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold, a great thinker, educator, back in the last century or earlier. And he said this, and I think these words are very important. The purpose of education, he said, is a pursuit of our total perfection by means of getting to know the best which has been thought and said in the world. And I notice that that important word there is our. It's our total perfection. In other words, lifelong learning is not for the benefit of your employer. It's not for the benefit of getting you a better certificate. Your lifelong education is for the benefit of you personally and your total perfection in getting to know the best thoughts which have ever been thought in the history of the world, the best ideas which have ever been expressed, the best words which have ever been put together. And that's what this is really about, the purpose of education. And I want to suggest to you that the only way in which you can do that is by reading. We stand at the most amazing juncture of history these days. We have every single resource which is available to you at your fingertips, at the click of a mouse button. You have all the great works of literature, all the great works of learning available to you at any moment that you like. The internet can provide that to you. The World Wide Web has it all there. And you only have to ask yourself the question then, if you study literature, you can familiarize yourself with the very best of what civilization has to offer. And you should do that, because people have been working on this for a long time. This is riches beyond comparison, if you think about it. So why wouldn't you want to do it? You teach yourself to read when you read books. You teach yourself to think. You teach yourself to communicate. And if you can read and think and communicate and express yourself clearly, then there is no stopping you. You can go anywhere you want. You can argue for that rise. You can persuade that group of people. You can present those arguments and take a course of action which everyone will follow you on if you can do those things. Think, read, communicate, express yourself clearly. So why wouldn't you want to do that? And that's at the core of what a university should be about. It's about learning. Learning to improve yourself and to bring yourself to the sum total of the perfection that's available to you. I'm going to suggest to you just 10 books, very quickly, books which have inspired me, books which I found personally well worthwhile reading. Books which, let me say, that it will change you if you read them in some way. What these books will do is they will manage to make sure that you have a wider perspective, a wider horizon, and a wider ability to see the world in a way which you've never seen it before. So these are books which have done that for me. I'm just going to take you through 10 of them and try to introduce you to and engage you in the fact that some of these books are well worth reading. You may have read them, you may not have read them. If you haven't, put them on your bucket list, the list which you have to read, the books you really need to read before you die, because these are going to be important for you. The first one I've got here is Zen and the Otter motorcycle maintenance. And you might say, well, Philip, I'm not at all interested in motorcycle maintenance. I'm not interested in Zen either. Give me something much more useful. And all I can say here is that this is not a book about Zen, really, and it's not a book about motorcycle maintenance either. But it's a book which will widen your horizons out like pretty well nothing else. Okay? We're in such a hurry most of the time that we never get much of a chance to talk. It's a quote from the book. The result is a kind of endless day-to-day shallowness, a monotony that leaves a person wondering years later where all the time went and sorry that it's gone. I suppose if there is one tragedy in life, it's getting to the end of one's life and realizing that there were so many things I wanted to do, so many things I wanted to understand, so many places I wanted to see, books I wanted to read, thoughts I wanted to think, and I've done none of them. That would be the greatest tragedy in life, I would think, to have had all of that opportunity and have just squandered it and lost it. Well, this book here will help you to gain something of that. And I think it will give you an insight into human nature. It'll also give you an insight into science. It'll give you an insight into the way in which to think properly. And it'll give you an insight into yourself, most of all. A book I would strongly recommend. Probably the best-selling book on philosophy that there has ever been. This second book, the Gulag Archipelago, is a classic. One of the things which the schools are very good at teaching you about is the dangers of 1930s Germany and National Socialism, and the way in which the Nazi Party rose up and caused ultimately huge extermination of people, and in addition to that, World War II and a huge, massive loss of life. But what you never hear about in schools is the other side of the coin. The dangers are not just National Socialism, but international socialism, the communist regime here of Soviet Russia, and the way in which they treated their people. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a survivor of one of these Gulag camps. And he said this: if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and just destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? Solzhenitsyn was a realist about evil, and he experienced it personally himself. He tells you story after story after story of story, and the stories which he tells are about some of the worst elements of human nature. And he exposed that within communist Russia. And in fact, you could say that this book really was the paving of closing down the Iron Curtain and Glasnost, and the opening up of all of that, and the bringing of the downfall of that communist totalitarian regime. The book itself is eye-opening in the extreme, and if you think you understand human nature, then I urge you to try and read this book, because you may find there are bits of human nature you didn't properly understand. It will certainly widen your perspective on what human nature is all about. My book number 3 is by John Stuart Mill. It's a classic on liberty, and it's really about the nature of the boundaries which separates the individual from the state. How should a country be governed? What should the rules be? And Mill said that, and this is his most famous principle here, it's called the harm principle, that every state, every country should provide every individual with the maximum amount of freedom possible. They should have as much freedom as they can take, and the state should not impose any laws, or regulations, or anything upon people whatsoever, provided, and here's the proviso, the only purpose for which power can rightfully be exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. In other words, every law, every statute, everything that the state should do is only and exclusively to prevent harm to others. If it stretches that beyond that boundary, then it's gone into realms it should not go. And it said, his own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. In other words, it's not good enough for the state to say, I'm doing this for your benefit. That's not good enough. Because the individual has the right to decide what's his own benefit in his own right. Mill makes this case and many other cases about how individuals should have as much liberty as they are granted in the right, as an inalienable right, and that the state should not take that away. It's been classic to argue that point. Then we move to a different kind of book now. There's a book about the different kinds of books, and novels are just as important to read as philosophy books or books on history. I would suggest that you can learn huge amounts from reading novels. Why? Because the well-written classic novel is something which can tell a truth in a way which no other version or medium can do so. It can get inside human beings and their minds and their thoughts and express them in a way which leaves you with a deeper understanding of what human beings are like. This is a book ostensibly about a whale, Moby Dick by Herman Melville. And Melville wrote in such a way as to bring out some amazing characters which are, let's say, archetypal characters. There's the evil Ahab, who is fixated on one particular element, which is revenge against a particular object, which happens to be Moby Dick. There's the conscience of the ship, and a guy called Starbuck. And there's Flask, who just gets on and does things and makes it work. But these characters are real in the sense that they express real human nature, real human attitudes to people, and there's a lot of learning to be involved in learning about Ahab. It will just take you down to the very depths if you follow his way of wreaking revenge on whatever in the world you hate. So, Melville, it's not down on any map. True places never are. And you could say the same about books. The truth is not easily found, but you'll find them in books like this. But there is a deeper kind of truth, hidden within fiction. There's another book hidden within fiction. This is a fiction book written by George Orwell. I tossed up whether to choose Orwell's 1984, which is a classic book of dystopian future, very similar to the world we're moving into, it seems to me, or this other one, which is an easier book, about Animal Farm. Animal Farm is meant to be a children's story. It's a children's story about animals who take over the farm and try to run it better than the human beings could. And it's a brilliant book. It's a very short book. You could read it in probably a day. And yet you'll come away understanding human nature better than almost anything else. And the way in which good ideas, good plans are corrupted so easily, and they become just the worst of whatever it was before. It's no better than what it was before. So I would recommend this book, George Orwell, Animal Farm, simple to read, and it takes the viewpoint that all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And that's unfortunately a lesson which they learnt within the book, that you try to set out equality for everybody, and soon some people are more equal than other people. Very interesting book, certainly well worth picking that up. Here's a book on philosophy. It's probably the very first philosophy book which I ever read. It's by Bertrand Russell, and it was called An Outline of Philosophy, or there's another one, The Problems of Philosophy. I think The Problems of Philosophy might even be better than The Outline of Philosophy. But get The Problems of Philosophy, and what it does is it expands out your whole mind and view about the world. It makes you think in ways you've never thought before. It makes you see a table or a desk or a chair or colours in a way which you'd never ever guessed that they could be pursued or viewed or conceived of in any particular way. And it just widens out your whole thinking processes by looking at some of the basic problems of philosophy. To understand the actual world as it is, said Russell, not as we should wish it to be, is the beginning of wisdom. And we often view the world as we want it to be, but the reality is that if we want to understand it properly, we have to learn to see below the surface and see the world as it really is. Russell's book helps us to do that. Book number 7. This is again, it's a children's book. It's very, very easy to read, and it's what's called A Little History of the World. Gombrich managed to write this book. He wrote it because I think a publisher said, "Can you write the whole history of the world in one book?" And he said, "Oh, I'll have a go." And he said, "The history of the world is sadly not a pretty poem. It offers little variety, and it's nearly always the unpleasant things that are repeated over and over again." Such an easy book to read, but you can get perspective when you get a perspective of history. They say that if you don't understand history, then you're condemned to repeat the mistakes of history over and over again, and that's very true. And what Gombrich does here is he introduces you to the key points right through history, takes you from east to west, and from west back to east again. He talks about the Buddha, he talks about Christ, he talks about the Egyptians, he talks about the Romans, he talks about the whole of human history in this small compass. And if you want to get a good perspective on where you sit in the world today and why the world is a bit like the way it is, then Gombrich's the one place to start. Once you've got that, you can wind up to much wider books on history. But that's a very simple, easy book to begin with, and it will widen out your perspective like very few books will. Just a few more books left. This one, I thought hard and long about presenting it, the Bible. You know, it's one of those books which you know so well or know of so well, and you think, well, you know, is that the kind of book I should be reading? All I can say is that the reason I've included it here is because there's probably no other book in the history of the English language, or any language really, which has had such an impact upon our civilization, upon our culture, upon our standards, upon our laws, upon our values. And if you really want to understand where all these things come from, then a lot of it comes from here. So you can't really understand the civilization you live in. Never mind the relationship with theology and understanding of a bigger, wider world. You can weigh that up for yourself. But even just looking at it from a cultural point of view, you cannot possibly understand the culture you're in without grappling with this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And from that simple starting point, it tells you about all of human history, all of human nature, and sets out a plan. Read it and at least be informed as to how you fit into the world. Two more books left. This was a very simple book to read. It's Jonathan Livingston Seagull by Richard Bach. It's such a small book. It's probably the smallest of all the books I've recommended here. And I would say it would take you no longer than an hour to read this book. An hour, maybe an hour and a half. That's all you need to read this. And what it does is it inspires you. It inspires you to seek to achieve excellence, the very height of the very best that you can do. It's all about a seagull. And this seagull is a unique seagull. Jonathan Livingston Seagull is a real seagull. And the seagull is quite different from all the other seagulls around. He's the one who wants to not just pick up food from dirty bins and live an ordinary life. He wants to do the very best that he can. And what he does best is flying. And he wants to be the fastest bird, the highest bird. He wants to do the very best flying, and he puts everything he's got into the excellence of what he does. And in that book, that simple book with those simple words, he inspires you somehow to want to do the very best yourself in your own life. There has got to be, it should be, more to life than fighting for fish heads. I think that's a good lesson for all of us to try to take on board. And finally, the last book. This is a more recent one. It's written by Jordan Peterson, who you may or may not have heard of. He's become quite a phenomenon recently. He's written 12 Rules for Life, and he's written another book, 12 More Rules for Life. And the idea here is that he was asked, what are the fundamental rules that you should live by on a Quora forum? I think it was Quora. And it's a kind of forum where people just post any old questions. What are the most important rules to learn to live by? And he just jotted down a few rules, which then became a kind of a viral upload. It was passed by hundreds of thousands, millions of times to different people. And he decided he would turn them into a book and talk about them. And his fundamental message is, we all have responsibilities, and the way that you get through life properly is by meeting your responsibilities. He talks in these kind of terms. He says that the main aim that you should try to do is to accept that you've got a role to play in the world, that you need to find out what that role is, that you need to do it as best you can. And you need to, as he puts it here, pick up your damn load, something that's of benefit to you and the rest of the world, and stumble forward courageously with it. Do whatever you can to improve the lot of yourself, of your friends, of your family, of your neighborhood, of your town, of the world around you. Whatever you can contribute, do it. And you may do it badly, poorly, but do it anyway. And stumble along and make a good contribution and improve the world in which you live in. That is the 10th of the books, and I've got extended reading lists, so anyone who wants to follow these, I've got more books which I can recommend to you. I've also got Jordan Peterson's reading list as well, because he puts it up online, and I'll be able to tell you more about that if you look at the notes. But let me end with this idea. Education does not begin and end with school or even university. And if you want to be a fulfilled person, a person who has reached their potential or is able to reach their potential, you have to take responsibility for your own learning. The best way you can do that is to read books. We have a fantastic collection of classic stories, books, novels. They're all available to us. Why wouldn't you want to do that if it improves your life hugely? Which it will do. And as I say, once you learn to read, you'll learn to think. And once you've learned to think, you'll learn to communicate. Once you've learned to communicate, you can go anywhere you like.